And so this week, I'm thrilled, absolutely thrilled to welcome a very special guest, and special in so many ways. And that will become clear as to why as we begin to talk. And so let me introduce you to Dr. James Mannion, and he's the Director of Rethinking Education, an organization dedicated to research-informed school improvement through learning to learn, practitioner inquiry, and implementation science. And he's the best-selling author of Fear is the Mind Killer. This is a book you can readily find on Amazon. He's got a master's degree in person-centered education from University of Sussex and a PhD in learning to learn from the University of Cambridge, and currently at the Centre for Educational Leadership in the UCL Institute of Education. James is also the host of the popular Rethinking Education podcast, which features long-form conversations with fascinating guests about how we might rethink, reform, and recreate education so as to bring more of a harmonious, less hair-raising state of world affairs. For more information, you can visit the rethinking-ed.org website, and we'll feature that in the show as we go along. And so James and I actually go back a long way, and I'm thrilled that he's also a member of one of my mastermind groups, which we may talk about throughout the show. And so the topic is going to be about rethinking education and implementation science, which James is a world-renowned thought leader on. And we're going to also share with you how implementation science can be of service to you as business leaders, but also as entrepreneurs. And so without further ado, very warm welcome, James. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be with you, Matt.
And so tell us about yourself and what it is that you're doing now.
Yeah, okay. So hello everyone. It's really nice to be with you. Well, you've just done a really good summary of what I'm about, really. So I run this organization called Rethinking Education, which is quite expansive. It's partly a consultancy, which is about helping schools and school leaders to get even better at what they do. And that's very similar, really, to the role that I do at the Institute of Education. But I also host this podcast of the same name, the Rethinking Education podcast, which has really taken off in the last year or so. We're going to have a conference, a face-to-face conference next year. And that's a much more expansive vision of trying to bring together. It feels like at the moment, after the pandemic, like the whole planet is sort of thinking about rethinking education, thinking like, do we want to go back to normal? Because actually normal wasn't really working for lots of young people and teachers and parents and carers. But there's lots of innovative practice that's happening all over the world, but it tends to happen in sort of little silos. You know, people are so concerned with what they're doing that they're not realizing that there are many other people around the world who are wrestling with the same problems. And so the Rethinking Education community, the podcast, has led to a community, and now what's going to be a series of conferences to bring all of these people together so that we can see one another, realize that there is strength in numbers, and see if we can bring about some system level change.
Absolutely fascinating. I suppose, you know, I because we go back such a long way, I just for our audience, I'd like them to know a little bit about the process as to how you arrived, because I know in private conversations we've talked about you know, I think you've called yourself a late starter, or a late starter in education. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So yeah, late developer, late start. Yeah. So I mean, I came to education age 30. I was sort of like didn't really do a great deal of career-based stuff in my 20s, other than, you know, like creative stuff. So I was very much interested in like performance poetry first of all, and then making music. And that's still a thing that I do now. I make rock operas in my spare time, like sort of sci-fi, psychedelic rock opera type things, which is great fun. And so I came to teaching quite late in my life, I guess, relatively late, at the age of 30. And I didn't plan to be a teacher. I knew that I wanted to get into education and to change the way that we educate people. Because it's, you know, the world is clearly a little bit, like you mentioned, it's a little bit hair raising out there sometimes, isn't it? And often, you know, especially with how divided, I've been thinking very much today, in fact, about how divided the world has become and how intolerant people are of other people's views. And I'm thinking, like, what can we do in schools to help kids to learn how to be more curious of other people who have different views to theirs, rather than just trying to shut them down, which is what's happening so much at the moment. And so I didn't plan to be a teacher, but I sort of thought, if I don't teach for at least a while, then I won't know what I'm talking about, and otherwise nobody will listen to what I have to say, because they'll think, what do you know, you know? So I became a teacher, and then it really just fascinated me, and I got really into it, and 12 years flew by. And I thought, okay, I actually need to take a step back, because being in the classroom is brilliant, but again, it's a silo situation. You can't take the more expansive view if you're just like marking books and planning lessons all the time. And so the way that I got out of the classroom, as it were, is that I got really interested in teacher research. As you mentioned, I did a research-based MA first of all, and then a PhD. And that sort of brought me into the orbit of universities and the Institute of Education. And that was how come I was able to to step outside of the classroom while remaining in education and remaining very much in schools. I still do lots of the work that I do is with teachers and school leaders and with young people themselves often.
I love how you talk about you know, focusing on the process of learning rather than what people learn in the curriculums. And often it's the process, it's the how to learn. And that's the magic, that's your superpower. That's what you're encouraging us all to think about, you know, how we learn. It reminded me, I know I mentioned this to you once, I don't know if you remember, but I was trawling through my granddad's books on his shelf, and it so happened that my late auntie, she was a teacher, and I discovered this book when I think I'd be about 9 years old, and I think it was called How We Learn or How We Study. And yeah, quite a precocious child, I snatched this book off the shelf, and it really grabbed my imagination, and it was a game changer. It changed my relationship to, you know, to learning. And I don't think kids, I don't think kids introduced enough to the process of how to learn. They're just shown what to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that people have wrestled with for a number of years, and it's been quite a faltering movement, if you like. So there was this big idea that came around in the 1970s called metacognition. I'm not going to do any more jargon today, but that word's really key, which is like cognition about cognition. So it's like thinking about thinking. And people started to realize that process of reflecting on how you learn yourself and to be sort of inner directed is really powerful. But lots of things have been done in the name of learning to learn since then that were actually quite flaky practices. Just to share one example, like there was a very widespread idea that was around called learning styles, the VAK. People are either visually, auditory, or kinesthetic learners, and that you can give your class of kids a questionnaire and you'll find out which kind of learners each of them are. And that was really widespread. When I trained to teach, there was a VAK column on every lesson plan, and you had to say how you were catering your teaching to meet the learning styles of these different kids. And there's no evidence that doing that is any better than not doing it, let's say. And so learning to learn has got sort of quite a bad name among some people within education, because they've seen these ideas that have been done in the name of learning to learn. And so a large part, like about the first third of the book that you mentioned, Fear is the Mind Killer, which is the story of my PhD, really, this 8-year-long study of a learning to learn initiative that we ran in a secondary school that I taught in, which had an incredible impact. Those kids went on to achieve the best set of results that that school had ever seen by some margin. And in particular, the disadvantage gap closed from the bottom up. So it was especially beneficial for kids from poorer backgrounds, which was amazing. That's exactly what we wanted to see. And that's the question that's on everybody's lips at the moment. So yeah, metacognition, like helping the kids to become more reflective. Speaking and listening was an absolutely huge part of that curriculum. So helping them to develop the confidence to be able to speak, not just to stand at the front of a room and to be able to deliver a knockout speech, although we did do that, but also like how to make small talk with someone at a bus stop, how to have a small, but how to make sure that if you're in a group situation that everybody gets the chance to take a turn, for example, understanding other people's perspectives, like we were just talking about. And it's amazing. You can see the kids grow an inch taller, and it's really that confidence that comes through that work that allows them to become more successful. And so you were saying that it's like the what and the how.
Yes.
I wouldn't say that we need to focus on the how of learning at the expense of what of learning. Like what we learn is really important, because you need to have something that you're working with. You can't think critically about like how to fix the tax system, say, without knowing a lot about the tax system, so knowledge is really important. So it's not instead of the what, it's like alongside the what. How can we teach kids how to become more proactive? Because often in schools everything is done to them, and so they sort of part of them switches off and they just sit there and it all just washes over them. And even if they remember it for as long as they need to get through the test, they often forget it shortly afterwards because it doesn't mean anything to their lives. So how can we switch that around so that people actually become lifelong lovers of learning?
Yeah,
absolutely what drives me.
You talk about implementation science, and will you help us understand in a nutshell what implementation science is?
Yeah, thank you. So I stumbled upon implementation science purely by accident. About 8 years ago, I was at my university at Cambridge, and there just happened to be an implementation science conference on. And I don't live in Cambridge, so I'm not there very often. So I think I just happened to be there on that day, and I stumbled upon this conference, and it absolutely blew my mind. So the keynote speaker that day, Barbara Kelly, said implementation science is remarkable for 2 reasons. Number one, everybody needs it like ASAP, whether you work in schools, in businesses, in healthcare, in government. And number two, nobody's heard of this thing. So it put very simply, it's a new field of study. It emerged about 15 years ago. Mainly it was focused on healthcare. So the Implementation Science Journal is essentially a healthcare journal. And you can look at it at a number of levels. At the most pure level, at the scientific level, it is the study of the factors that make the implementation of change initiatives effective or less effective in real world contexts. So it's a study, but obviously it's an applied science, because there's obviously a point to that. It's like we want to get better at implementing stuff. And when I ask teachers and school leaders, like, to what extent are change initiatives successfully implemented in your school, usually the figure that comes out is about 20% of it is successful, which obviously means that 80% isn't. And we get the same statistics in business. That you often hear the word, like the figure 70% bandied around, that about 70% of change initiatives in businesses fail to achieve their stated goals. And if you think about the scale of the problem, like even just within schools, because I think about implementation science currently because I'm an educationalist, I'm thinking about it within schools, but it's definitely applicable in healthcare, in business, in politics more widely. Yeah. And if you think about, how many change initiatives are happening at this point in time on the planet, how many people are spending a chunk of their hours today, trying to implement some change initiative, and 80% of that time is wasted. It doesn't lead to the changes that we want to see. So if we can use implementation science to improve that number to, let's say we get to 50% of them being successful, the impact of that on people's lives could be absolutely massive. And so it's an applied science. And then at the most practical level, what I've been spending the last 2 or 3 years really refining is this toolkit, which is like a very practical set of tools, ideas, strategies for how to implement change effectively in real world contexts.
I know this is really grabbed people's imagination, and I think your book was a real catalyst in that process. And I know your podcast has really sort of gained lots of traction now, but your initiatives are being talked about globally. And I know on the opposite side of the world, you're working in partnership to have your initiatives rolled out within schools, and so it's really blowing up.
Yeah, it's an incredible thing. There was recently a podcast called From Page to Practice, which asks, like, focuses on a different book each time, and they ask people to send in audio clips of how this book has affected their practice. And it was amazing. Like, people were phoning in from China, from Cambodia, from Italy, from South America. It is incredible. Like, the book landed about a year ago, and it was in the middle of a very difficult, it was the pandemic, right? And everyone was sort of overwhelmed. And that's a bad point in time to release a doorstop of a book about how we should do things fundamentally differently.
Yes.
And so it's been a little bit of a slow burn, but people are now coming through, who's saying, okay, I've now bought the book, and now that things have calmed down a bit, I've had time to read it, and wow, we need to be doing this. And so now I'm working with schools throughout the UK and around the world to implement these ideas and to scale this up.
I really love the equation that you use, which I think can be extrapolated to the leadership world in terms of project management and entrepreneurs as well, setting up and expanding businesses, up leveling. Do you want to tell us about the equation? I think it's really succinct, and I think it'll really speak to people.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, just as a sort of preamble to the equation, essentially, when you're implementing a change, there's a why, like, why are you implementing the change? There's a what are you going to do? And then there's a how are you going to implement it? And usually the why and the what are really good. They're really good ideas, because otherwise people wouldn't be trying to implement them, right? There must be some evidence that it's worked elsewhere, or it's an obvious solution to the problem that they face, say. But you need to have all three of those things working, or else you're going to end up with bad outcomes. So the equation is that you've got the why and the what and the how of what you're doing, and then you've also got the enabling context, which is like, to what extent is the organization or the environment that you're in set up to enable this change to take place. And then you've got implementation quality, like how well are you implementing whatever it is that you're doing. And all of those things have got multiplication signs in between each of them. And like, so the what times the why times the how times the enabling context times implementation quality equals successful outcomes. And the neat thing about that equation is the multiplication sign, because if anything on the left-hand side of that equation is 0, then the outcomes will be 0. Like, you need to have all of those elements cooking on gas. And that's the thing. And even a simpler way of thinking about it is almost like a 2x2 grid, where you've got the what and the how, if you like. And you can have effective implementation in terms of, like, an effective idea. Is the what a good idea? Yes and no. And is the how you're implementing it good? Yes or no? And there's only one good outcome there. You need to have a good what and a good how. And there's a lack of know-how around about how to implement change effectively in real world context. And just to briefly just say that, to recognize the scale of the problem, like, we talk every week, don't we? And I have this interminable internal dialogue with myself about the most basic stuff, like about bedtime, about diet, about exercise, about meditation, about screen time stuff. It's like really basic, but it's so hard to change your own behavior in a lasting, effective way. Like the sort of the New Year's resolution phenomenon. People go to the gym and they go loads in the first month, but then for whatever reason they have a holiday or whatever, and then they stop going back. Like, to actually change your behavior in a way that is sustained across time is really hard to do, because the habits are just so deeply ingrained. And that's if it's yourself, and you're at least ostensibly in control of yourself. You can physically take yourself up the stairs to bed at a certain time, but it's really hard to do that consistently. And so if you're thinking about organizational change, thinking about something the size of a school where there's 100 people, very diverse, they're all in it for different reasons, they've got different values. Some of them are up to here with it, some of them are really eager and want to move on with the next thing. Like, the scale of the problem is vast. Like, how can we implement it, given that no two schools are alike, no two businesses are alike, and they change through time? So how can we implement things in such a smart way that it can adapt dynamically to all of those factors as we move through time?
Fascinating. And how would you boil that down in terms of, like, a top tip for business, somebody engaging with their businesses in terms of generating successful outcomes?
Yeah. So one, like, it depends on the size of the business. And so I'll give you two answers to that question, if you like. One is like, let's say you're in a big organization and you want to implement change. One of the problems with organizational change on a large scale is that it's often decided by the leaders, by the people at the top, the management or whatever. And that's a black box situation. Like, they have meetings, they decide what needs to happen. They generally don't publish the minutes of those meetings. So no one knows how these decisions are arrived at. And then decisions are sort of announced, and they say, right, everyone, we're all got to do this now. And that's often like one of the reasons that that doesn't work often is that people don't like being told what to do, even when it's a good idea. You know, I was listening to a talk with somebody just the other day who was saying that she was a really avid reader as a kid. She wouldn't stop reading. And the only time she couldn't read was when she was made to by a teacher. She was like, she almost couldn't bring herself to do it, because just the fact of being told something just sort of doesn't turn you on. And so what you want to do instead, probably the main idea in the program as it applies to schools and large organizations, is this idea of a vertical slice team. So that the change team is not just people at the top, but you have people who are represented at different levels of the organization. So in a school, you would have a senior leader, a middle leader, an early career teacher, a teacher who's been teaching for 30 years or more, the special needs coordinator, a teaching assistant, whoever it is who's going to be affected, who's got a valid perspective on whatever it is that you're trying to implement. And then you get representatives of those people sitting around the table together, and they're jointly responsible, for writing a really robust implementation plan for how to implement this change, thinking about it from all these different angles. And you have to do a bit of work to set up ground rules as to how that team will work together equitably. Because often there's this phenomenon called groupthink, which is that, like, you often get, when you get groups of people together, you sometimes have quite unhealthy group dynamics that stop you from making good decisions. So let's say, for example, the boss says, we're all going to do X. And somebody who's, like, you know, not particularly high up in the organization thinks X is not going to work. And I know why X isn't going to work, but I'm not going to stick my hand up in a public forum and, you know, contradict my boss, because that's like going to be really awkward. And also it's like not smart career wise. So I'm just going to keep quiet. And so there's just one example of how groupthink plays out. So even when you get the smartest people in the world sitting around a table together, you know, some of the smartest people in America decided that the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba was a good idea, you know, because there's nobody in that room to ask the stupid question, as it were. So you want to have people who aren't just all like-minded, who aren't considered to be the smartest people or the most effective people necessarily. You want to have a range of views. And we know there's really good evidence that when you have a range of views, you arrive at good decision-making.
Yeah, I love that. I love the top-down approach. Well, but having a full cross-section, you know, because I think in terms of people being invested in the process as well. And if you've got people, stakeholders at all levels, and they're responsible for consulting with their peers, it's fascinating, the potential.
Yeah.
Often top-down approaches, it's very oppressive for people at the lower levels. And, you know, taking a grassroots approach, sometimes it's incredibly difficult to get the messages heard above.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's not grassroots, it's not bottom up as opposed to top down. It's like all levels working simultaneously. Yes, yes. And exactly as you say, so like one of the first things we do is that we do a data collection exercise. We call it 5-minute interviews. So the teaching assistant in the team goes and talks to other TAs about their views, and you ask questions like, you know, what do you think about this idea? Is this what we should be focusing on at this point in time, or do you not think this is a priority? What ideas do you have? What questions or concerns do you have, and so on? So the TA goes and interviews other TAs. The middle leader goes and interviews other middle leaders, and so on. And then they bring that back to the table, and it is so powerful because it anonymizes the process. Like, you don't know who said what, so it makes it safe for people to air their honest views. And then instead of it being this top-down black box, you've now got a glass box where we can see out, we can see what people think of what we're doing. They can see in, so that they know what we're doing, because we do publish minutes and so on. And they feel represented. There is somebody like them on that team who they can talk to if they've got any questions. So all of a sudden you've got everybody's invested throughout the organization, and it's not some like hollow consultation exercise where the decision's actually already been made. You're actually, you know, like listening to people. And that's the second thing. So the second part of this applies to somebody who's just like a one-person startup as well, which is that you want to start with, like, I mean, this is quite commonly understood in the startup literature. There's a famous book, The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, where you start with like a minimum viable product. You just have this like basic sort of skeleton of an idea, and then you work with people to get feedback on it continually, and you collect data across time, and then you use that data to inform decision making in an ongoing way. And with that in mind, like it almost can't go wrong. Like in theory, at least, like it can't go wrong if you're going to follow the data, and you're prepared to be agile and responsive to what the data is telling you about how to do this thing effectively. Then you're continually orienting yourself towards the optimal way, or if you like, the least bad way of doing whatever it is that you're doing. And that, you know, that just doesn't end, you know, and when you're bearing in mind that what you're doing a year or two from now might look very different to what you think you're going to do now, but you followed the data in getting there. So that's hugely important, I think.
I've heard you say before how goals are overrated, and so you're inviting us to think more about a focus on the process, on the daily habits, and yeah, grinding away at sort of being consistent.
Yeah, absolutely. And because it's like when you're a kid and you write a revision timetable, and then like you don't stick to it for a day, and so then you write another revision timetable, and you're just like so obsessed with the goal setting of like, my goal is to actually do some revision, that you don't actually ever do any revision because you're just so focused on the goals. Like goals are really important, and it's important to have, you know, like SMART goals, to use that old acronym. You know, it's a really good idea to have goals, of course, but like once you've got one, just leave it. Like you say, it's far more important that you're able to grind it out. And I mean, that's mainly come from my reading around behavioral science and habit change. You know, there's that famous line in the book Atomic Habits, that we don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems. A book by James Clear, which I highly recommend to anyone if you haven't read that. That's a really good point. You know, like it's what you do every day that makes the difference, not how brilliant your goals are.
And being held to account, right?
Yes, yeah, that's a huge part of it, and that's one of the reasons that the masterminds group is so effective, because it's this lovely sort of combination of accountability with support. Like it's not like you're going, right, who hasn't done their homework this week or whatever. And that's a huge part of this, the implementation science program as well. So there's a community that sits alongside it, a mighty network where people are sharing what their plans are. And then, you know, it's like a soft accountability, if you like, but we know that when you say what you're going to do out loud, there's this thing called an implementation intention. So you say, like, on Thursday, I'm going to go for a run around the park twice at 6 o'clock, you know? And so you declare that, you put it on Facebook, or you tell it to your family members or your friends or whatever, or even just saying it out loud to yourself. It just makes it so much more likely that you're actually going to follow through with that.
I know you've been in my masterminds when people, and you know, yourself included, you know, we have light bulb moments. And my mantra, which I'll never get bored of saying, is, you know, knowledge is not power, execution is, or application is. And so then the question is one of contracting. You know, okay, so now you've got this information, you've got this awareness. I mean, we might have done some sort of like laser coaching, some deep diving, you know, but it's like, what are you going to do about it now? How are you going to implement that? And so contracting out loud, consulting with the group, what kind of behavioral assignment do you want this week, and being held to account to it. I think that's the magic, the accountability.
Yeah,
it's one of the key components of change and transformation too.
absolutely.
James, we're running out of time, and would you care to let us know how people can contact you, and just run through what your offerings again? Because I know many people would have heard of you already, and I'm sure I've read your book. But for those that haven't, remind people what it is, or share with people what is it that you're offering.
So currently, my consultancy is called Rethinking Education. Excuse me, and I work mainly with schools and school leaders around three areas really: learning to learn, which is what the book is about. That's the stuff about the how of learning. Practitioner inquiry, which is about how to improve what you do by carrying out what's sometimes referred to as action research or R&D. It goes under many names, but it's essentially a bit like learning to learn for adults, right? So you're setting, rather than doing professional development where you like go on a course and tick a box to say you can jump through these hoops now, you're like become an active problem solver. So that you're looking at the situation that you're in, and this is applicable. I've used this in other organizations, not just in schools. So practitioner inquiry is like how to get better at your job in a smart way, and it's what you want to have. I was reading an article yesterday about the sort of the tension that's often, especially you see it in public sector, where there's people are so obsessed with following systems and processes that have been set in a top-down way that they're not able to respond intelligently to human needs at the point of contact, you know. And so what you want is to have people who are thinking at every level of the organization, who are looking at what's coming in and they're saying, yes, you know, there are systems in place that guide us, but actually we need to be able to use our autonomy and our intelligence to make smart decisions that might not have occurred to the people who designed the programs that are guiding us, you know.
Yes. And so you've got your implementation science for schools program.
Yeah.
And that's being, I mean, that's being rolled out internationally now. And there's the Rethinking Education Mighty Network.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. That's for anyone who's interested in that broader agenda of changing education. So with regard to anyone who's watching this, who's not from the world of education, but who's interested in implementation science, please do get in touch, because I've sort of got a plan. my 15-year plan is like to, first of all, just like take it might be quicker than 15 years. That's the conservative estimate. To first of all get this thing to take root across the education sector, across the planet, right? Because it should be a quick win. When I talk to school leaders, they know that they don't know how to do this. They know that they launch endless initiatives that fizzle out, and they don't want to do that anymore. And so it's quite an easy sell. And then I've also been already talking with people who work in healthcare. They face exactly the same problems. That lots of top-down initiatives that never actually go anywhere, and I'm going to move into that world, and then into the world of business, or not necessarily then, like whichever order it comes in. But these ideas are really generic. You know, I was just thinking about the implementation science for schools program. It's actually doesn't really mention schools all that much. These are like generic ideas that have come from the world of implementation science, but also from the business literature and also from behavioral science and psychology. So I've pulled together stuff from all different areas, but it's not really come from the world of education. It's just about how to implement change effectively and how to understand how people work. So it's absolutely applicable in other contexts, in business contexts, for startups, for large organizations, charities. So if you're interested to find out more about that, please do drop me a line. So you can see, so the website that's scrolling across the bottom of the screen, rethinking-ed.org, there's a contact tab on there that you can drop me a line through, or you can find me on Twitter. I'm Rethinking James on Twitter.
James, it's always a delight speaking to you. I always feel renourished, replenished. You always put a little. You're so hugely entertaining as well to be around. And I'm not going to let you off lightly. You dropped in earlier. The fact that you had a rock opera that you were playing with. This rock opera, folks, was rolled out sort of nationally, and didn't you do a few international dates as well?
No, we've not done.
Was it the pandemic that closed that down?
We've not taken that. Yeah, we wanted to tour it, but yeah, the pandemic sort of put paid to that. But we did. We have performed at Union Chapel in London, which was unbelievable. I don't know if you know that venue. It's like a cathedral-sized church. It's absolutely magnificent. And that was for the first. So I've done 2 episodes so far. The first one was sort of like a reimagining of the final judgment. So this guy it's sort of loosely autobiographical. It's this guy who wakes up into death's waiting room, and he has to like justify his life to the angel of death. So to do that in this massive grand church setting was amazing. And I'm currently writing part 3. So watch this space.
Oh, wow. So I want to thank you once again. And so that's so nice to be connecting with you. And we're going to be replaying this as well as a watch party on Facebook. And we're going to coordinate it at a time that you're going to be available. So if people do have any questions, they can pop them below and we can be engaging with them in real time, so to speak.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, look forward to hearing from you.
Right.
And thank you very much, Matt, for having me on. I would just echo your lovely, kind comments. I absolutely adore you and the work that you do, and I think you're a beautiful man. And I look forward to seeing where this relationship takes us next.
Yay! Thanks again, James.